Hello, welcome to the Elixir of Awareness channel. You're watching the episode 21. In this episode, we want to travel to the depths of the darkness of the skull to find out what things happen there. And we want to see if science can help us get rid of a series of bad feelings or not. You may ask yourself what the darkness of the skull means. It means we want to hold a flashlight in the darkness of our skull to understand how our brains work, how our emotions are made, and this kind of pieces of information. Our primary source for this section is a very good book called Unfuck Your Brain, written by Miss Faith G. Harper. Before it, we talked about the brain and mind on the Elixir of Awareness channel, but in this episode, we'll discuss other aspects of brain cognition. Before starting, we must remind you that the human brain is very complex and its knowledge requires very complex information. And in this episode, we'll only try to provide you with a series of simple and understandable explanations. Let's not forget that the more we learn about the functioning of the brain, the more we realize that there are still many things to discover and learn about it. But we assure you that at the end of this episode, you'll learn a lot of good information about our brain function. So stay with us. The main purpose of our brain is survival. All the effort of our brain is to keep us alive and maintain our survival. Actually, for example, happiness and pleasure or other good and pleasant feelings are secondary priorities for our brain. Feelings that sometimes occur and sometimes also don't occur. This survival often leads to the production of suffering in us. But this suffering is necessary for us to survive. But to better understand this process, we first need to know the structure of the brain and learn about the function of the brain. But when we talk about the structure of the brain, we must first know the three important parts and their functions in our brain. The first part is the prefrontal cortex. This part is located behind our forehead, and according to research, it's the last part of our brain that's evolved. If we want to explain better, this part is the logical and guiding part of our brain that analyzes the dos and don'ts. Research proves that this part grows and completes, even up to the age of 20. Also, this part controls our behavior and tries to stop our destructive decisions. One of the reasons that working with teenagers is a bit challenging is that this part of their brain is developing and forming. In general, this part of the brain is responsible for thinking and making logical decisions. The second important part that we should know a little about is the amygdala. The amygdala is where our experiences and emotions are recorded. For example, when our finger is burned by fire for the first time, this bad feeling is registered in our amygdala. And as a result, if we don't put our hand near the fire the next time, it's because that bitter memory and bad feeling are remembered by the amygdala. Actually, the amygdala is the danger alarm of our mind. And it constantly reminds us of the dangers and risks in our daily experiences. All our perceptions and experiences of events are formed and recorded there. The third important part is the brain stem. This is the oldest part of our brain. When the amygdala sounds the alarm in our mind, the brain stem kicks in and controls everything. The brain stem is the instinctive part of our behavior that helps us survive. These three important parts each have a role in our survival. When the amygdala presses the alarm button in our mind, the brain stem takes control of everything. And the point is that in this situation, the brain stem doesn't take orders from the prefrontal cortex unit and itself sits behind the wheel of the brain and takes control of the situation, because it feels that we're in danger. And many of our quick and unconscious reactions are due to this part of our brain. Brain stem starts from under our brain and continues to the vertebrae of the lower back. By knowing the function of these important three parts of our brain, we understand the roots of our decisions, and then we also understand the reason for many of our unconscious decisions. Imagine you're driving on a road and you're listening to music and talking to your friend at the same time. Suddenly, a cat passes in front of the car, and at that moment you unconsciously grab the steering wheel with both hands, and in a few thousandths of a second, you show a timely reaction. And even at that moment, you pay no attention to the sound of the music and also your friend's voice. And your friend will stop talking unconsciously. All these decisions and reactions are due to the functioning of this part of our brain, which is responsible for maintaining our survival. Interestingly, when the danger is removed, your attention is again drawn to the music and you listen to the continuation of your friend's conversation. Actually, when the brainstem takes control of everything in an emergency situation, it may issue several commands. For example, fight, run away, or hide. In 1895, when the film of a train entering a station in Paris was broadcast and people saw this scene for the first time, most of them either ran away or hid behind the seats. Because the amygdala in the brain of those people had sounded the alarm, and that is why they showed the strongest reactions. According to the author of the book, the amygdala always does its job well, but sometimes our brain makes mistakes in separating and distinguishing real dangers from false dangers. In fact, many times the alarm goes off in our minds for no reason. And many of the bad feelings, such as unreasonable anxieties that form in us, are due to the functioning of these amygdalas. Our brain's performance isn't very good at distinguishing between real and fake dangers. Actually, the author of the book tries to make these feelings and things that we consider dangerous into self-awareness, so that we don't consider some things dangerous that aren't really dangerous. Maybe it's better to give an example. Many of us are afraid of public speaking. This is because we may have had a bad experience before, which makes us afraid to speak in a similar situation. For example, we may have been ridiculed before, or we were able to speak well, and this bad experience is recorded in the amygdala of our brain, and 10 years later, this fear and anxiety will show itself again in a similar situation. In fact, the amygdala thinks like this instead of us. If I start speaking again, that bitter experience will be repeated and I'll be ridiculed, and this ridicule will lead to depression, and this depression will lead to endangering my health, and as a result, my survival will be endangered. Therefore, the amygdala sounds the alarm in similar situations. It may be interesting to you that even the bitter experiences of our ancestors thousands of years ago were also influential in the formation of this part of our brain, and many of our unconscious reactions occur for the sake of our survival. In fact, Mrs. Dr. Harper explains that we shouldn't consider everything a danger and a threat. But as we said, not only our own experiences but also the experiences of the generations before us have had an impact on the formation of this important part of our brain. For example, one of our unconscious reactions in dangerous situations is the skin goosebumps. It's interesting to know that this is an ancient reaction, because in the past it helped to make them look more voluminous, bigger, and scarier. And actually, this reaction helps them survive. But today, those millions of hair follicles still show that ancient unconscious reaction. For example, our fear of snakes or spiders, which we may not encounter even once in our lives, is another one of our ancient fears. So, some of the fears that we've are fears that may have been real before but may aren't real today. Actually, what the author of the book says is that the amygdala sparks with a specific experience, and sometimes our brain catches fire and shows a strong reaction. But if we can understand the reasons for these sparks, then we can act more wisely. Our brain is a survival machine by learning. Let's repeat this important sentence. Our brain is a survival machine by learning. It means that our brain is constantly watching the world and experiencing different emotions by learning. And the brain that constantly reviews those injuries and sufferings is healthy because it helps its owner to survive. In fact, it does its job well because it helps the person to survive. A good brain reviews and remembers the history of the person's memories and experiences so that can avoid possible harm. In the following, the author talks about trauma. Trauma is a severe psychological injury that was beyond our understanding and control. Traumas are very important for the amygdala. When we've a painful sensory experience, the amygdala records it and keeps it so that the bitter experience doesn't happen again. For example, a good example is the experience of losing someone. When people lose a loved one, apart from sadness and longing, many of them experience anxiety. This is because when we lose someone, the alarm goes off in the amygdala, because we're afraid that we may lose other loved ones and become more lonely. And this anxiety that we experience with mourning is caused by this issue. Here, an important question is, What injuries become a trauma? In life, we're constantly subjected to various sufferings and experiences. We solve many of them, and many of them also have a deep effect on us. But suffering must have several characteristics to become a trauma. First is that it's very intense. The second is that it's unexpected. As we said, our brain is a learning machine that has a habit to control and predict events. But when an unexpected event occurs, we react strongly, and the red alarm button is sounded by the amygdala. Another feature of trauma is that it's long-term and stable. You may experience pain that isn't severe but is persistent. For instance, you can bend and straighten a pen slowly many times. As a result, the pen will suddenly break in half. A series of sufferings are exactly the same also, with low intensity and weak but stable. Another type of suffering are those sufferings that we can't express. That is to say, the cultural coordinates of our society don't allow us to talk about them. So they turn to trauma also. For example, if someone is a victim of sexual violence in a society, and they aren't even allowed to raise it. So this suffering can turn into trauma. Just like a wound that we ignore, and it gradually becomes infected and difficult to treat. Sometimes we don't know the reason for our suffering and it bothers us. It means that suffering is hidden. For example, a personal emotional relationship may have collapsed due to a reason such as a betrayal. The experience of betrayal indeed takes a lot of emotional energy from the person. But what turns this suffering into trauma is a question we keep asking ourselves. And that question is, why did they do this? And what was wrong in our relationship? And these unanswered questions that surround all of our existence cause that suffering to become a trauma inside us. Let's take a quick look at the trauma futures again. Be severe, be unexpected, be stable and long-term, be hidden, and we can't express it and answer it. Now we ask you, do you recognize a trauma in yourself that when you review it has these characteristics and caused your amygdala to sound the alarm in your brain? The reaction of the amygdala to traumas is usually several behaviors. One is arousal. For example, when we're in a situation similar to that old dangerous situation, we get very angry, our blood flow increases and our heart beats faster. Another common behavior is abstinence. This means that we can't face the conditions that evoke that old dangerous trauma. And the next is disturbing thoughts. It means that negative thoughts are constantly flowing in our minds. Many of us review these negative thoughts in our minds. It can be said that the main reason is that our brain reminds us to be careful of possible dangers so that we don't get hurt again for the same reason. And the very interesting thing that the author of the book points out is that if we ignore these thoughts too much, our brain thinks that we aren't paying attention to them, and as a result, it produces those negative thoughts more intensely. And in fact, we should always show our brain that we're aware. But may you ask how? With paying attention. We need to pay attention to our feelings, allow them to form, and care about them. For example, suppose a radio broadcasts negative news around the clock, and we can't turn it off in any way. But contrary to the positive thinking advice of fake psychology, that says you should listen to another wave of good news to ignore the negative news. Maybe it's better to let that radio play and listen to negative news just at a lower volume along with the positive news, and live at the same time. We've to let that special feeling pass through us, whether good or bad. One of the interesting techniques is to choose a name for that feeling. Try to give personality to those feelings. For example, if you're getting anxious by the phone ring sound, you can consider a special name for this moment and this feeling. And instead of running away from it, and instead of hiding it, accept the feeling of anxiety and get a little closer to it, and try to establish a deeper connection between you and that feeling. Believe that this technique will help you a lot to reduce your suffering. Sometimes feelings are like people who are talking inside our minds every day. And how good it would be if we let them talk to each other and thus recognize the personality of each one. So remember that ignoring and denying and not attention-owned feelings is a form of attention. In simpler words, we should try to solve our problems with the amygdala, because if the amygdala is activated, then also makes the brain stem activated, and eventually we'll no longer have any control over the situation. Here we've to do two important things. One is to see the reality, which means to accept and understand that suffering and trauma inside us. And the second thing is the conscious processing of our story. For example, anger is one of the emotions that happen to us, and it's very effective for our survival also. Many times people survived because of the experience of anger. And because they were angry, they were able to save their lives or others' lives. Anger isn't only a negative thing, rather it can be said that it has positive aspects as well. Many social changes are possible because of this feeling of anger. What is important is how to analyze anger and in what direction to use it. Psychologists discovered that one of these states occurs when we get angry and anxious, or we're exposed to damage, or our expectation hasn't been met, or our needs aren't met. Conscious processing of the story means that we may not be able to think about these things at the moment of anger, but we can think at the first opportunity what was the main reason for our feeling of anger or anxiety. For instance, if we're afraid of speaking in public, we can ask ourselves if it's really a thing that threatened us in that situation. Is the judgment of others so important that it can lead to my death? Absolutely no. Or another question is, was my need not met? And is my expectation from the world or people a realistic expectation? Another important point that helps us to understand the functioning of the brain is mental mobility. When suffering occurs in our body and settles in our soul, we must try to move this suffering and place it in its proper place. One of the most useful techniques is writing. If we write about our feelings, they'll not stay in one place and won't become a trauma. Another point is that when we understand the amygdala and how it works, we shouldn't think that by knowing it, we can control it completely. On the way to recovery, it's completely normal that sometimes we may feel bad. Remember that this fluctuation is completely normal. And we need both good days and even sometimes bad days in life. In the final chapter of the book, the author presents techniques that help us manage our emotions. The first technique is speaking. At this stage, we should only try to express our feelings in general. The second technique is touching. It means to fully understand that bad feeling. And the third technique is to understand the effect of that suffering. It means that we can clearly feel the effect that suffering has left on us now. And the last technique is to face and fight those bad feelings. Actually, in the facing stage, we say hello to our feeling and embrace it. Believe that these techniques can help your inner peace a lot. At the end of this episode, we ask you to choose a name for your unpleasant feeling and then explain what is your experience about that. Please share your comments with us. We know that this may be a little difficult for some of you, but believe that you'll feel better with this simple technique. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this episode.